Oh, hi there. It's Marcus from TalkSober.com. Today what we're going to be doing, obviously, since I have this, is going through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and talking about some of the questions people have about sobriety, getting sober. Is it religious? Do I need God? Do I need to follow this plan? Do I need to go to meetings? And what is the major deal with this book? Now, what I'd like to do first and foremost is define a few things for you. Number one, let's define what spiritual is, right? You're going to find out in a lot of alcohol recovery related stuff this idea of spiritual solutions, right? So let's clear the path right away and talk about what it is. What is spiritual? Well, there's two definitions to the word spiritual. Number one is relating to or affecting the human spirit or soul as opposed to material or physical things. So what spiritual is in part one is relating to your spirit, your soul, different from material and physical things. Okay, very important. Number two, relating to religion or religious belief. So these are the two definitions. You're either something that is not physical or material, or it is something that is the soul or relating to religion or religious belief. So what we want to do is we want to keep that in mind, because a lot of people ask, Marcus, to stay sober, do I need to go to church? Do I need to dive into this AA? Do I need to find God? Do I need to get the Bible or whatever? Now, it's important to remember that when AA was founded, it was in the 1930s, 1920s and stuff like that, where these guys were trying to get sober. During that time, you had the Prohibition, you had a lot of revivals, a lot of Enlightenment, Christianity stuff going on in America at that time when it was founded, and there was a lot of emphasis placed on spiritual awakening, or being born again, as the Christians called it, or having a renewed mind. And a lot of this stuff infiltrated the alcohol stuff because, a lot of the physicians back then didn't know what to do with an alcoholic. Much like right now watching this, you might say, well, I don't know what to do with the alcoholic, and I am an alcoholic. And a lot of this stuff happens because, it's a misunderstood type of issue, right? You say, well, it should just be a mind power or a religious power or whatever. Okay, so we want to take a look at this. We want to take a look at two things. Number one, how to get and stay sober. And number two, how to decrease recidivism, if I said that correctly. Sorry, I'm not that great with some words. But what that means is how to reduce relapse, how to reduce going back into old patterns. So what we want to do is want to take a look at this and say, is there anything in this book or in this type of way of thinking that can help us? And I think there are some very important things that they go through in this book, and I want to kind of point them out here. I got them all outlined for you so that you can learn this stuff, make your own decisions, and learn how to stay sober. There's been lots of people who have stayed sober with Alcoholics Anonymous. It's great. I am not a ongoing practicing member, but at one point I did look at it to see if there were solutions there, and for a lot of people there are. Unfortunately, for the vast majority, the relapse rate is ridiculously high. The amount of people who go back into drinking is ridiculously high, and it kind of seems like a perpetual ongoing fight against this thing called alcohol. Now, one of our commenters on our videos was saying that, if you understand the idea of the big book, the reason this is why that is because there's no defense against the thought process that leads to the first drink, right? There's no defense against that first drink. That first drink is almost inevitable, that person said. And we want to look at this and say, well, is that the idea here? Is the idea that, hey, look, we conquered alcoholism for right now, but at any point in time, alcohol is just going to jump into your mouth and you are going to have trouble with it again? Or is this saying something else? Well, first off, let's take a look at the doctor's opinion. He says on page XXIX, I don't know Roman numerals, but I think that's like 29 or something like that. I don't know. You could figure it out. All right, and what he says is, I do not hold with those who believe that alcoholism is entirely a problem of mental control. So he's saying here, you know what? I'm a doctor. I've looked at this stuff. I don't think it's entirely an issue of mental control, because if it was, right, these people would be able to control it mentally. They would be able to battle it mentally. Now, I agree with this. I don't think it is entirely a problem of just willpower and mental control. They go on in page 14 of the regular text. He says, one of the things that helps is a destruction of self-centeredness. I find that interesting. Okay, let's put that in our back pocket and say that's interesting. All right, another thing on page 15, he says, I was not too well at the time, speaking of when he was drinking, and he said, I was not too well at the time and was plagued by waves of self-pity and resentment. Interesting. Then he also says, this sometimes nearly drove me back to drink. This is important because he's saying right up in front, right, this is Bill's story, I believe. Yeah, this is Bill's story. And he says, I wasn't too well. I was plagued by waves of self-pity. Okay, self-pity is self-pride and resentment towards others and towards things that he had done and everything like that. So he's resenting things. And then he says, this sometimes nearly drove me back to drink. So here he was, he's been sober a while, and he's like, these things, the self-pity and resentment, nearly drove me back to drink. But I soon found that when all other measures failed, so when everything failed and these things were in his mind and he was going crazy with them, he said, you know, everything almost failed, but I figured out that working with another alcoholic would sometimes save the day, would usually save the day, right? So getting his mind off of himself is what provided the defense against that first drink, because sometimes he's like, hey, I wanted to go back to drink, but you know, if I worked with another alcoholic, it would take my mind off it and get my mind off of the self-pity and resentment, and it would help, right? So very important there. He also describes it on page 20 as a hopeless condition of mind and body, right? A hopeless condition. And a lot of people are saying, hey, we have recovered from this. So he's saying we have recovered from a hopeless condition of mind and body. So that hopeless condition of your mind and body that you might be feeling now, or alcoholism often brings us, is something you can recover from. Very important. On page 21, he says, but at some stage of his drinking career, talking about a continuous hard drinker, someone who struggles with this stuff, he says that he begins to lose all control of his liquor consumption once he starts to drink. So once he's starting to drink, he's losing all control. But if he doesn't start to drink, he can't lose control because he hasn't given into it. Let's go on and see what the whole of this is as well, because we want to look at this as a whole. We want to say, well, what is this trying to tell us? What can we extract from it to help us keep sober? Now, it's curious, in page 24, he says, we are without defense against the first drink. Now, at first, we're going to look at this, and we say, well, that would seem to be that we're just walking around and we are without defense against this first drink. Meaning, hey, check it out. I'm going to be going throughout my day and the first drink's going to be like, boom, I'm going to take you, right? Not us taking it, it's going to be it taking us, or vice versa. Strike that, reverse it. He also says that the almost certain consequences that follow taking even a glass of beer. So this is right after, right? The almost certain consequences that follow even a glass of beer don't crowd into the mind to deter us. So he's talking about what is referred to as the built-in forgetter. The forgetter that says, hey, look, you remember what happened last time, right? You drank and you became an idiot and you hated it and you went into alcoholic insanity and it didn't work. And he's trying to say, hey, look, you know, sometimes these get clouded out by the desire to drink. Sometimes it's so strong that nothing else matters, right? It's kind of like a survival mechanism, right? When you're in survival mechanism, you're not thinking about your morals and values and things like that. You're thinking about survival. And that's why oftentimes when I talk about the alcoholic, I talk about it in terms of someone who's gone through a very, very difficult situation, right? You read the memoirs and the writings of Viktor Frankl, who talks about his time in concentration camps and everything like that, and how sometimes people would be completely unrecognizable after being in these camps because it would change the foundation of who they were and change the foundation of how they believed and everything like this. And the same thing's happening here. The alcohol is clouding it out, and your desire for the drink is so powerful that right now you can't see the solution or even recognize what the solution would look like if it was right in front of your face. Another one, page 27, he goes on to say, they appear to be, and he's talking about the phenomena of the spiritual experience and everything like that. He says, they appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Now, what does this mean? Again, looking at that idea of someone going through a situation where everything gets changed, right? When you're in survival mode, you might say, you look at those people who've gone through terrible, terrible situations and they ate people to survive or whatever. And you think about yourself and you're like, I would never do that. That's crazy. But what happened was a huge emotional displacement and rearrangement, right? Their values became disaligned and they become so consumed with survival and hunger and everything that their life literally changed, and their ideas and their emotions and attitudes, as he says, which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men, are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. Now, this works both ways, right? This rearrangement and displacement of emotions and attitudes can work for bad, leading you down a path of bad, as we've seen in the Sanford prison experiments, as we've seen time and time again with all these different psychological tests and stuff like that, and real life tests with people going through terrible things. Oftentimes their emotions and their belief systems and everything gets restructured and rearranged, and it makes you unable to think clearly, right? This is a big, big issue that I see with a lot of people that say, you need self-help and you need to study and you need to learn and you need to understand about alcoholism and everything like that. And, a lot of people say it's not a disease and it's not this or it's not that. Well, I don't really know what it is. I'm not a doctor. But what I do know is that when you go into drinking and when you go into alcohol insanity, what happens is your mind gets consumed with drinking, and you can't see it happening, right? It's the one that we never see coming that gets us. And we look at this and we say to ourselves, what is the key here? What is it that needs to happen? And clearly, we're only on page 34, and clearly in this book he's saying, well, hey, look, these things have been tweaked. Your values have been realigned. It needs to be put back where it was. And I look at this as why a lot of the Alcoholics Anonymous people look at a spiritual experience, and they say it's spiritual. Because a lot of times this stuff, when a person becomes religious, when a person gets quote-unquote born again or saved or whatever you want to call it, when they join a religious group, whether good, bad, whether cult, whether true, whatever, doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is what's happening is your values are getting readjusted, right? You go through something so profound and so severe, like concentration camp or like a religious experience, that these things change, and all of a sudden you look at things through a different lens. And it's very important to look at. A book that I would highly recommend if you're interested in this and Alcoholics Anonymous and things like that is the book A New Pair of Glasses by Chuck C. And he talks about how this works. It's very important. And he says, we feel, as we look back, we feel that we had gone on drinking many years beyond the point where we could quit on our own willpower. All right, so there was a point we could quit on our own willpower, but now our values have been realigned, and now this is equated with survival, and it's equated with so many pleasure mechanisms in our brain and so many things to survive. Then you have the compound effect of the alcohol actually taking over your mind and manipulating the way that you think, right? So a lot of times we look at this and we're like, well, is alcohol a disease? And this concept was popularized when people didn't know what to do. Well, in the sense that alcohol makes someone crazy, right? In the sense that alcohol makes your thought process different, yes, it is actually creating the symptoms, I believe, of a mental illness. Now, can you fix a mental illness without outside thought, without realigning your values, without realigning the way that you think? Maybe not. Maybe you need something else, and that's what he's going on to say. He also says, whether such a person can quit upon a non-spiritual basis depends upon the extent to which he has already lost the power to choose whether he will drink or not. Okay, so have you lost the power to choose? Have you become to where your values and everything are so realigned that you literally have to drink? Okay, now a lot of this stuff he's talking about once you have this spiritual awakening or this spiritual thing, which I know a lot of people are driven nuts by the spiritual, but again, I refer you back to the definition of spiritual. It's not like, hey, you know what, go sing hallelujah in the chorus. It's something different, right? It's not material, not physical, and it's referring to a belief system, okay? Now, they are offering a belief system that they believe has worked, and a lot of these things in here are good, and you can use them. You can embrace them without saying, oh, well, I need to go in here dogmatically and read everything and become obsessed with it, okay? Now what we're doing is we're getting into, on page 36, the part where we're talking about, do you have a defense against the first drink? Are you literally waiting for relapse? And I see this a lot with people in alcohol groups and religious groups and things like that. They're literally waiting for the next failure, right? They're sitting there and they're like, okay, well, relapse is pretty much inevitable, so I gotta, just sit around and wait, and hopefully the spiritual stuff will work. And a lot of people say, well, my higher power is what protects me from that, or whatnot. So the question is what can we do to fight this? What can we do to combat it? Number one, we got to get sober. Plain and simple. You got to get sober. You got to get your thinking track back to where it was, so you're thinking rationally, right? Just like if you were to try to rationalize with someone who is in like a major cult, very difficult to do, or rationalize with someone in a concentration camp and say, hey, you know what, there's something you can do here, right? They might have lost all hope, which realigns their values. Now, we want to look at this because on page 36, he starts here and he talks about his this salesman guy who was like, okay, well, we want to take a look at this and we want to see how this guy relapsed or how he went back. So first of all, he says, yet I got drunk again and everything like that. He says, one, I remember I felt irritated, right? He was irritated because now he was the salesman in a dealership that he used to own, right? I used to own this, now I'm selling for it, which kind of was like a step back. Like for me, when I first got sober, it was very difficult to drive by my old house because I felt like, even though I sold my house at a profit, I felt like, hey, look, you know what? You lost this, buddy. You suck. And it was very big blow to pride, right? And oftentimes I felt irritated. Okay, so he's saying, hey, look, I felt irritated, and this is why I felt irritated, because I screwed up my life, and, I felt this way about this, and I had to take a demotion, and my pride was hurt. More or less, that's what happened. Then he says down on the bottom, or towards the bottom of page 36, suddenly the thought crossed my mind. So there's the first thought. Right there it is. So there's our first defense, right? It wasn't that he just took the drink. First of all, he felt irritated. That's number one, right? Here's the resentments, here's the stuff coming in. He feels irritated. And then he says, suddenly the thought crossed my mind that if I were to put an ounce of whiskey in my milk, that couldn't really hurt me on a full stomach. I mean, whatever. So he ordered the whiskey and poured it into the milk. And vaguely he sensed he was not being too smart, so he knew he wasn't being that smart. But he felt reassured because his stomach was full, and the other times he drank, whatever. Okay, so first of all, it started with his feeling irritated. Then the thought crossed his mind. So feeling irritated, it's like, okay, when you feel irritated, your mind searches for solutions to not feel irritated, because we don't want to feel irritated, right? We look at that and we're like, I don't like to feel irritated. Boom, your brain says, well, I remember a solution, and that solution is to go out and drink, because it'll shut off the irritation, it'll shut off your mind, it'll slow everything, because it's a mind-altering substance, which is why it produces insanity, which is why you feel like you're going crazy when you can't drink, or don't drink, or can't stop drinking, or whatever, because this is hijacking your mind. So, very important. Now, he also goes on in page 37 to say, yet all reasons for not drinking were easily pushed aside. So here I am, I'm irritated, I have this thought, and between the thought and the drink, all the reasons for not drinking were pushed aside, right? So he's not really rationalizing. He's like, okay, well, you know what? I'm going to push these aside because I don't want to feel irritated, plain and simple. Then he goes on to say, this guy Jim, there was always the curious mental phenomenon that parallel with our sound reasoning, there inevitably ran some insanely trivial excuse for taking the first drink. So there's this curious mental phenomenon where you're obsessed with this. One, probably because we're kind of control freaks and we're like, I don't want this one thing to be able to beat me. Well, plain and simple, if you are being beat by something that affects your mental capacity, you're not weak, it's just something affecting your mental capacity, right? It's like someone who has a stroke or someone who has a brain injury. All right, it's not a weakness, it's just something that has affected their ability to think. Now, the difference is we are choosing to take this, right? At one point, we chose to change our mind with this, okay? We chose to say, I'm going to drink this even though I know this is what's happening, right? So the justification here is insanely trivial. It's like, okay, I know that I'm going to be completely jacked up if I do this again, but my brain says, well, you like it, right? Don't you miss the taste or whatever it is? And you use that little excuse to get the solution. Now, again, he goes on page 41, and he says, as soon as I regained my ability to think, I went carefully over the evening. He's like, okay, what happened? He was there. This is a Fred guy, and Fred was there. He was away on business, and he's like, well, I went, and I was sober, and then I had cocktails with dinner. And he got hosed because, you know, once you have the first drink, it's very difficult to stop the second. And the third, because of the fact that it is affecting your mind, right? So he says, as soon as I regained my ability to think, I went carefully over that evening in Washington. Not only had I been off guard, okay, so he's been off guard. He admits, like, hey, I was off guard. Boom, right? I was caught off guard. I'd made no fight whatsoever against the first drink. So he's saying, I made no fight, which presupposes that there's a fight to be made. He just didn't choose to take it. Very important. So what I'm looking at here is, what is it that we can do to fight the first drink? Because if you can never take the first drink, you're never going to have the second, and it's never going to lead down the path where you know it's going to go, right? The key is to remind yourself of this and say, hey, this is where we're going to end up. And he said the reason he made no fight is because he hadn't thought of the consequences. He didn't think about, hey, what's going to happen? Then he goes on in page 42 to talk about strange mental blank spots, where your mind blanks out and says, well, you know what? I want the alcohol so bad. And this is often like the people who go through experiences where their values are aligned and everything. Then he goes on in the bottom of page 42 to say program of action. Okay, so a program of action is what's going to help us. And whether you use this program of action or a different one is entirely up to you. Just find something that works and understand what's going on. He goes on to talk about the alcoholic mind, right? How is the alcoholic mind different from the sober mind? Here again he says, on page 154, again, it was the old insidious insanity, that first drink, right? The insanity of I should be able to have this first drink, that insanity saying that you want it. It's the phenomenon of craving, it's the phenomenon of your thoughts and everything like that. And what we want to really do is look at our value alignment, and we want to look at the working of our mind versus the content of mind, okay? Craving a drink, thinking about a drink, the insanity of the first drink is OCD, right? It is the working of your mind. Your mind is working in a certain way. If it wasn't alcohol, it'd be something else, okay? Now, with alcohol, you're compounding it with the fact that alcohol is changing the way that you think about this stuff. So it's like quadruple threat. All right, so we look at that and we're like, okay, here's what's happening. And that's what was going on. And he says in page 157, there was much talk about the mental state preceding the first drink, right? That's why it's so big on, okay, well, deal with your resentments, deal with your stuff, you know, get a higher power, things like that, because we want to get our mind off of the content of mind and into the working. When you have a spiritual working of mind, which isn't to say like a working of mind, oh, yay, hallelujah, whatever, it's to say your mind is not working just to think of right now pleasures, just to think, as it says, material or physical things, right? Alcohol is a physical thing. Mental process is a physical thing. And when we look at this, it's like, okay, it's easy to get sucked in and say, well, you know, let's dwell on that. And instead of saying, well, let me just pull back and say, well, I know my mind's working that way. Obviously, it's going to crave it because it's had it so many times and it's worked. And obviously, the built-in forgetter is going to say, well, you're not going to end up that bad this time. It's going to be okay, just like the guy with the whiskey, right? Instead, what we do is we say, that's the working of the mind. Obviously, I'm going to have that craving. Obviously, I'm going to have that thought process. But the defense is in knowing that the thought process is there and not fighting it. Because when you fight it, you say, wow, why am I having this thought? It's bad. Okay, well, why do I want alcohol? It's bad. I know what it's going to do, right? And you're fighting it in the context of content of mind rather than working of mind, right? There's lots of videos on my channel. I would say subscribe, definitely subscribe. Check out my video on OCD and my video on getting rid of thoughts that you don't want, because that is the nature here, right? It's saying, hey, we want to look at this and say, what is the solution, right? The mental state. How do we combat the mental state here? How do we combat the insanity? And number one is by getting sober. Number two is by staying sober and putting up a defense against these things, because you are not defenseless against the first drink, other than the fact that it's going to manipulate your mind, right? You do have a defense, and your defense is training your mind to think differently. Not in a sense of like self-help and things like that, but in a sense of really changing your value structure and having an experience, whether it be religious or whatever, right? Of something that's going to change the way that you think about it. Another thing he says in page 227 is we were staying sober as long as we kept and talked together, right? A lot of people believe that one of the reasons AA works for the people it works for is because of the fellowship that's missing from life, the honest, direct communication about our problems with other people, right? We're social people. That's what we look at here. In 251, he says, nothing had changed, yet everything has changed. You'll see this often with spiritual stuff, right? It's like, okay, well, nothing changed, but everything changed, right? My life is the same, but the way I think about it is different. The way that the content of mind is no longer bothering me, and now I am looking at the working of my mind and working on that. Another one, he says, page 256, he says, have I ever wanted a drink during these years? He's talking about being sober and everything like that. He said, only once did I suffer from a nearly overpowering compulsion to take a drink. Again, the compulsion, right? This is OCD, obsessive of the mind, compulsion in the body. Just like the people who have to like lock their door 50 times. It's an obsession of the mind, which compulses them to do something in the body, locking the door, which makes them feel better. Same thing with you and I. We have this obsession of our mind to go drink, and the actual act of it makes us feel better because we're giving into it. Very important to look at. Now, this is very important because he gives you the secret on page 256 for him. I shut my eyes and I asked for help, talking about seized. He says, I was seized with an almost uncontrollable desire to reach out for it, to reach out for drinking, right? And he says, I shut my eyes and I asked for help. So he got his mind off of himself, and in 15 seconds or less, the feeling passed. You could literally stop the world in 15 seconds. You just stop, you pause, you say, you know what? I'm going to be okay without it. And a lot of it has to do with training our brain to get past those thoughts, training our brain to say, you know what? This is just content of mind. That's all it is, right? And that's when we start to get better, is by repetitively doing that stuff and repetitively showing ourselves that these thoughts aren't going to kill us. Going out and drinking probably will, but these thoughts won't. All right? Another one. Let's see here. He says, I quickly substitute one or another vivid scene from the nightmare of my later drinking. Right? So instead of like letting these thoughts get out of control and go crazy, he's like, okay, well, let's think about instead what happened. Let's dwell on the bad stuff that I remember from drinking, the things I know that are inevitably going to happen when I take that first drink, right? These things are what gives you the fight against that first drink. Then he says on page 330, this is in the stories where he's talking about the various stories. The first half of the book is like, here's what to do, here's how Alcoholics Anonymous came to be. The last half is stories of people putting it into action. He says, what I didn't know back then, was that when I put alcohol in my body, I'm powerless over how much and with whom I drink, all good intentions drowned in denial. So it's interesting because he says, well, when I drink, it affects my mind, which means I'm powerless now, right? So when you give into this, obviously, someone who affects their brain with something that's going to change the way they think, right? For me, I went into depression, I went into despair, I went into self-loathing. Drinking for me affected my mind, and I couldn't get out of it because I was affecting my mind with this stuff that said there is no working of mind, it's only content. Alcohol makes you focus on the content of mind, the guy who pissed you off, the things you feel about your job, the things you feel about your spouse, the things you say to yourself, the stories you repeat of who you are and why you are the way you are drowned, and all you can do is think about the content rather than, hey, this is the way my mind works. How do I deal with it? Very important. Another one, he says on page 334, and I'm giving you these to show you that, hey, when it comes to the first drink, you do have power against it once you restore your mind and once you follow a plan and you start to change the way your values are aligned, which they would say is the spiritual awakening, the higher power. When I put alcohol in my body, I'd lose the ability to choose how much I drank. There you go, right? The choice is how much once I put it in. So once you affect your mind with something that changes the way you think, you have no power over your thoughts. Not a really brain-busting concept, but something that we overlook, right? We don't look at it this way. We don't look at the fact that alcohol is changing the way you think. Why can you not get past it? Because you're using the brain affected by alcohol to try to fix it, right? It's like trying to go and get someone who has OCD to fix it through thinking, right? You can't fix a mental problem by thinking about it. You need something outside. You need to change the values and the belief system that are below that, right? Very important. He says in page 335 that God had restored him to sanity. Right? His sanity got restored when he had started to do these things, when he started to change and stop drinking. God had restored him to sanity, right? And obviously, you look at that and it's like, what restores us? Well, restoring us is like getting away from the alcohol, right? It's going to change the way we think. Very important there. Let's take a look at another one. He said in page 400, but she said, if you had to control something, it was out of control. I like this because it's talking about, okay, if you have to control something, so you might be looking at it now and you're like, I'm trying to control my drinking. I'm trying to change my drinking. All right, the fact that you want to control or change it usually means it's out of control, right? Like I don't overly correct my car when it's on the highway unless it's like in a groove and it's kind of out of control. I got to control it back into my control. The same thing's happening with alcoholism, and you look at it and it's like the fact that you have to control it, the fact that you're questioning these usually means that, hey, it's gotten a little out of hand and let's check it out, or a lot out of hand. And there's a lot of debate in the alcoholic groups of what's a real drinker, what's not a real drinker. And one of the books I read called Asylum by William Seabrook defines it as a problem drinker is someone who has lost the ability to choose, someone who drinks even though it's no longer pleasurable for them. And I remember when I was drinking, it wasn't pleasurable. I didn't drink because I wanted to. I drank because I had to. And if you feel that way, chances are it's really a big issue. Some other things we'll look at, some quotes from the big book, and I'll put these on the screen if I remember to put the pages and things, talking about the power over the decision to drink the first drink. He says, I pushed the drink across the table. He refused it. Talking about when Bill was sitting with his friend, and his friend was a drinker, and now he's spiritual, and now he refused it, right? And he was disappointed but curious. He said, what got into him? He wasn't himself. I pushed the drink. I'd have to take it if someone pushed it to me, right? And he's saying, well, what's the deal? Now, his friend had the power over the decision to drink the first drink. Another one, he says, I was not too well at the time, and I was plagued by waves of self-pity and resentment. This sometimes nearly drove me back to drink, but I soon found out that when all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. That's one we looked at where he's saying, hey, look, you know what? This is what gets your mind off of it. This is what helps you, right? And there is a defense there, right? If you're obsessed about it, go do something. Action keeps you sober. Knowledge gives you options. Another one here. But what about the real alcoholic? He might start off as a moderate drinker. He may or not become a continuous hard drinker, but at some stage, his drinking career he begins to lose all control of his liquor consumption once he starts to drink, right? He begins to lose all control once he starts to drink. Now, that's once he starts. That's when the control is lost. We are equally positive that once he takes any alcohol, whatever, into his system, something happens both in the body and the mental sense, which makes it virtually impossible for him to stop. Again, once he takes it in, the insanity starts, right? This is what's happening. That's why that first drink is so important, because once that's in you, once that affects your mind, all bets are off. All things are going to change. Another one, he says the experience of any alcoholic will abundantly confirm this. And can you confirm this, right? Once you take the first drink, does it change your mind? Does it change the way you are? And do you end up the next morning saying, what the hell happened? That's because of this insanity. He's saying, yeah, it's virtually impossible once he starts. Another one he says that one we were talking about that he made no fight whatsoever against the first drink. He didn't make a fight, right? It was like the thing just happened. And he says, the alcoholic at certain times has no effective mental defense. And notice, certain times has no mental defense against the first drink, except in a few rare cases. Neither he nor any other human can provide such a defense. His defense must come from the higher power. And to me, I look at the higher power as, well, I don't know what the higher power is, but I know it's not me. And I know that with my experience, my situation has changed to where my values were realigned, and I no longer am obsessing about these things like how he was obsessing about, now he's working as a pitty little salesman in the business he created, right? He was pissed off about that, and he was angry about it, and he got hung up on it, which is what led him to drink. And obviously his values had not aligned to a spiritual value, because that is exactly what's going on, right? Material or physical things. That was, that's the anti-spiritual option there, right? Are you looking at things spiritually, which is deeper than these things? Are you looking at its surface value of, oh, you know what? I lost my house, or I lost this, or whatever. Or are you looking at it in a different way? Another one, he says he's an intelligent man, normal as far as we can see, except the nervous disposition. So he has a nervous disposition, anxiety, or whatever you want to call it. And he says, I came to work on Tuesday morning. I remember I felt irritated, then suddenly the thought crossed my mind and everything was off to the races. And he says, not only had I been off guard, but I made no fight whatsoever. Right? So we see throughout this book, in context, if you read everything in context, a lot of people like to take stuff out of context and make it read whatever they want it to read. But when we look at this in context, we're saying, okay, what's the deal here? The deal is that alcohol changes the way you think. All right, cool. We know that, right? That's why we're here. That's why we're watching this video. And we also know that without drinking, we're not going to have that effect on us. Okay, so there's the gap between right now, I'm okay. And if you're not sober, you're probably not okay. All right, but I know that when I drink, the insanity starts. So there's this gap here between okay and insanity. And the gap is bridged by the first drink. Well, whatever reason, right? However our mind works with that first drink. So we look at it and we say, well, what is our battle against that first drink? Well, first of all, we need to get sober. And we need to do that by detoxing, whatever. Don't detox on your own. Go to a doctor. Go to talksober.com/help to learn how to do that. Second, we need to have the defense once we've been sober a while and our mind starts to come back. We need to have that defense against cravings and against these things so that we're not giving into impulse. Now, he's saying the defense is not going to come by, saying, well, hey, check it out. I lost my house and I'm pissed about that, but whatever, I'll get a new house. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about a realignment of values that says, well, is that house what really mattered anyway? Is working your job really what matters anyway, or is there something deeper going on, right? And we want to look at this and say, well, let's take a look at what he's saying. He's saying 15 seconds can change the world. 15 seconds can allow you to say, I'm going to stop right now, right? Give yourself 15 minutes. If I still feel that way in 15 minutes, you know what? I always have the choice to drink, right? You can always go drink. Plain and simple, okay? This idea of powerlessness, everything like that. We're powerless against what happens with our mind when we start drinking. That's what you're powerless against. Am I powerless against taking the first drink? No, I'm not, right? I can choose to have it or to not have it. Just like right now, if you've been sober 20 years and you're watching this, you have the power to go drink, as do I. You also have the power to not drink, as do I. We do not have the power of what happens after we choose to drink, which is what stops me from drinking. I don't want to find out what can happen, right? Is it worth it? Is it worth it for me to go drink and figure out if I can have one? Because when has one ever been enough for me? Right? I know the way that my mind works, and I know that the content of mine is going to try to lead me back down those paths because it was something that worked at one point. And again, we have the cultural indoctrination of you should be able to handle your liquor, you should be able to drink and stuff like that. But the fact of the matter is it's producing mental insanity. And what we see throughout this book is, hey, look, something outside you needs to change. Something fundamental about your values need to change. And that's why, you read spiritual things, and it doesn't matter which way you are, spiritual, atheist, agnostic, whatever. Doesn't matter here. Let's look at the principle. Right? The principle here is a principle in the Bible talking about being born again, right? What does it mean to be born again? Well, when you're born, you put all these values and all these things are instilled to you, which bring you where you are. Your stories about yourself, the way that you think, everything brings you to this point, and now you're at this point, and you got to drink because you don't like this point, and you don't like where you're at, and you don't like the way your thoughts have become, all right? When you get born again, or you change your values, or some kind of experience changes, you look at this with William James's book, The Variety of Religious Experience. He talks about what's happening with these revival. Why did some guy go here and he's like a crazy person and then all of a sudden he's okay? Well, it's because of the value aligning. It's because of the things that change at the core. Now, this isn't something that happens like with the work and stuff like that. It's something that happens through experience. It's referred to in recovery as the 2-foot drop, the drop from mental knowledge to heart knowledge. Sure, you can believe it. Like, how many of you guys know lots of Christians who are worse than non-Christians, lots of Mormons who are worse than non-Mormons and stuff like that? And the reason you have these people is because it's not gone from head knowledge to heart knowledge, or they don't really believe it, or worse, they only believe it for non-spiritual advancement, right? They believe that God is here just to help them in their life, to get better stuff, to do better things, and they're still focused on themselves, right? Same kind of thing with Alcoholics Anonymous. You have people who are just happy as a clam, loving their life, living it, saying, you know what, I'm not even thinking about drinking because I love the way my life has become. Then you have the people who are miserable saying, gosh, I got to struggle through it. I can't drink. I can't do this, right? They're focused on them. And that's what this idea of spirituality in recovery is all about, taking it from the physical and the material and saying, you know what, I need a fundamental change in the way that my life is structured so that I no longer have to drink. And I remember it said by one of my mentors when I was going through recovery, he said, you know what, invent a life you don't have to escape from. Right? Why do you have to escape your life? And more importantly than why, and going on that rabbit trail of why, what kind of life would you like to be living? What kind of person would you like to be? And we look at that, and fundamental change comes through repetition, comes through understanding, comes through experience. So subscribe to my videos, and I will do the best possible work that I can to help these videos give you and produce that experience in you throughout your life. So subscribe to the videos, go over to talksober.com, put your name and email in the box, get the tools and stuff like that, and I will help you remain sober and get sober. So hopefully this video has helped you understand the concept of Alcoholics Anonymous, where it came from, what the religious stuff's all about, and some of the tips that'll help you stay sober, because there are some good things, right? There's good stuff. But we want to realize also where it came from. A lot of it came from religious stuff. At that time in America, there was a lot of self-help stuff like Think and Grow Rich and Change Your Thought Process type things as well. And we want to look at that, and we want to take that at face value for what it is, right? And we want to understand, as I learned, take the good, take the things you can learn, and leave the rest. And as I heard, you only need a few good ideas to beat this. You only need a few defenses against that first drink to be able to stop this, to be able to beat it. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to make some videos. Make sure that you subscribe to this channel. I'm going to make some videos for you on things that you can do. Take some of them you'll be like, Marcus, that would never work for me, right? Some of them you might say, wow, you know what, that thing is a lifesaver. And oftentimes these things will be a lifesaver, and we got to have that defense. So first of all, get sober. Second, when your mind's cleared up, let's talk about how this stuff works. Here on my channel, we got our live casts every week, and we're here to help you stay sober. So again, I'm Marcus from talksober.com. Go there, put your name and email on in the boxes, and let's get you sober, and let's help you out with this stuff. Again, thank you for watching. I had a good time going through this video with you, because this is stuff that's really helped me. When I first started, I didn't want to be an AA puppet, and as you can see, I'm not one. And you don't have to be one. All you have to do is find what works for you and make it work. And I find a lot of value in the value realignment, the belief realignment. We're going to talk about that more. Thanks again, Marcus. Go to talksober.com, hit the subscribe button here on YouTube, and let's stay sober one day at a time, living life the way it was meant to be lived, not completely full of ourselves. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.